Hey, what's up guys, DKV here, and I'm making a guide on how to gear your barbarian, what stats you're looking for, what items are good. I've had a lot of questions about like how I know which gear to keep, how I know about what gear to sell, which gear to imprint, and this will hopefully just encompass all of that. I'm going to try and make it as concise as possible, but I do want to talk about everything, and the first thing I want to talk about is weapons. An important thing to understand about weapon mods is something called damage buckets. And how this works is there are different mods that are grouped together and are all additive within themselves, i.e. the same bucket. And there are other ones that are standalone modifiers that are in their own bucket. And how it works is you take your initial damage and then you multiply bucket 1, you multiply bucket 2, you multiply bucket 3, and then you get your final damage, okay? And so what I mean by this is, like, let's say I'm doing 100 damage, okay? And let's say I have a critical damage multiplier of 200%. So what's going to happen if I crit, I'll deal 100 damage, but it's a critical multiplier of 200%. So I'll do 200 damage instead, okay? Now, let's say I have another multiplier, like let's say I have damage versus slowed enemies of 30%. So I'll hit that 200, and then I'll do another 30. We'll just round and call it 70. So I'll do 270 damage, okay? Now let's say I have damage versus bleeding enemies of 30%. I'm not going to take this 270 number and then multiply it by 1.3 to get my new number. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add the 30% damage against slowed enemies and the 30% damage against bleeding enemies into their own bucket. So it'll be, I'll deal 100 damage, I'll crit and do 200 damage, and then this 200 will be multiplied by 1.6, which is the entire bucket of damage against monsters affected by an ailment, essentially. So this will be 200 times 0.6, which is what, 320 damage? So there are some mods that are more valuable, and those mods are basically ones that have their own bucket, because they give the biggest multipliers. I don't want to go too in-depth about it. Hopefully that's not confusing, but that's the basics. It kind of explains why I value certain mods higher than others. Alright. And let's look at my weapon. One sec. Okay, let's look at my weapon. And I value swords the most because they have the critical strike damage implicit. You can see up the top, 52.5%. And critical strike damage is better than the other mods, so swords are my personal preference. Also, the 2,436 damage per second, that's the base damage of the sword, which is extremely important. That's the most valuable mod on a sword. And then we're going to look into like roles that I consider to be mandatory. And these are all like mods that have their own bucket, like I was describing earlier. And that's damage to core skills, critical strike damage, and vulnerability damage. So you want any weapon to have at least 2 of these 3. As you can see, I have vulnerable damage and critical strike damage, so that's 2 of those 3. And I would not run any weapon that does not have at least 2 of these 3, okay? And then going on to the important mods, which are, I kind of call them like half mods. They're half as good as the previous mods I mentioned, which is damage to CC'd enemies, slowed enemies, bleeding enemies, close enemies, anything like that. They all are under the same bucket. They're still a multiplier, however, they're a lower tier. I kind of value them as like 0.5 of a mod. And then beneath that is helpful mods, which is like damage to injured, damage to healthy, and strength. And then that's kind of how I would evaluate weapon mods. So I should have a pop-up kind of describing like what to prioritize, and I'll have that as well for other pieces of my gear. Hopefully that makes sense. If you don't understand what I'm saying about the whole damage buckets and multipliers, take my word for it and go watch other content that's more in-depth with that. I don't want to spend the entire video talking about that. Alright, so let's go on to gear. And first, we're looking at our helmet. Okay. And let me pull up. Okay. We're looking at helmet. So the mandatory role, as in like a role that I would not... I would only run a helmet if it had this role, is cooldown reduction, and specifically high cooldown reduction. So this helmet has 13.5% cooldown reduction. That's amazing. Important role I would consider to be life. This is like the second most valuable one. And then side, like, kind of helpful roles would be maximum fury, life on kill. And then lastly, like, roles that are usable but not that helpful are resistance roles. So my helmet has the mandatory CDR role, the important life role, and then it has a couple of usable roles. And real quick, I'll explain why I think that resist is not that valuable. So if you go here, you look at my fire resist, I'm at 51.6% fire resist. I have a massive 51.2% fire resist roll here. What happens if I take it off? It goes down to 42.9%. So basically, a massive fire resist roll doesn't really impact your fire resist that much. And even then, your resistance only matters for half of your defenses because armor takes into account that as well. So essentially this, like, as you can see, it says my damage reduces incoming fire damage by 25%. And then I take it off and it's 21%. So this fire resist roll is like 4% less fire damage taken, which is not that, like, it's an okay mod, but it's not as useful as other things, and that's why I do not value resist that highly. They're nice to have, not like something I would prioritize on gear though. Okay, we'll go with body armors. I'm using a unique here, but I'll still go over some of the mods on body armors. So I think that there's no mod that's mandatory on a chest. You're okay, like, you don't have to have a mod on a chest. I think important mod is life, plus ranks to shouts, damage reduction from bleeding, and damage reduction from close enemies, okay? So these are all important survivability modifiers. Helpful modifiers, I think, are dodge, healing gains, other sources of damage resistance, and physical damage. And then the last tier, the ones that I'd be okay with, are resist, and any other mod like thorns or stuff like that I wouldn't even care about. Okay, moving on to gloves, and a mandatory role is plus ranks to Whirlwind. I would literally wear this pair of gloves if it had no other stats besides plus Whirlwind, even if there was one that had 3 other good stats. Like, it is that important to have plus ranks to Whirlwind. Another important role that's not mandatory but is important is critical strike chance. Helpful roles are attack speed, and then chance on lucky hit to gain resource back, which is our fury. And then usable roles are like all stats and lucky hit, chance to heal. Okay, and let's scroll down to the pants. So pants, again, there's nothing mandatory on pants. You don't have to have any mod in order to have a functional Whirlwind build. Important roles, however, are life, damage reduction from bleeding enemies, and damage reduction from enemies that are close. These are both, like, really good mods. Helpful is dodge, and then plus healing gains, and then other sources of damage reduction. And then usable is just resists. And I would like to talk a little bit about this damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding. I think that this is an insanely powerful mod. All enemies we are fighting will be bleeding. And you can see my damage reduction from bleeding enemies is 31.9%, which is huge. I also have this imprinted on my amulet now, which basically adds another 30% damage reduction against bleeding enemies. It doesn't technically add, it gets diminishing returns, so it's closer to, like, I'll have a little over 50% damage reduction from bleeding enemies. But that over 50% damage reduction from bleeding enemies is essentially like I have my challenging shout up at all times. And the only investment I have on it is this imprint, an amulet imprint, this roll in the pants, and this roll in the chest for 50% damage reduction, which is extremely valuable. Alright, moving down to boots. So the mandatory roles are Fury cost reduction and movement speed. If I had to pick one, I would pick Fury cost reduction, but I really would not want to be running without movement speed either. I would try and be getting boots that have both of these. Important mods, like mods that, like, you really want on them, there's none. Like, there's basically none in this tier. Helpful mods are movement speed after killing elites, dodge, berserking duration, and then finally usable ones are resist rolls. So, yep. And let's look at our amulet. So an amulet, there's actually 2 mandatory roles, similar to the boots, and that's cooldown reduction and fury cost reduction. Your build, in my opinion, is most like how smooth it feels with generating fury for Whirlwind with cooldowns from shouts is directly tied to how good your amulet is. It's the most important to have a very high cooldown reduction and very high fury cost reduction. As you can see, my other 2 stats of strength. The strength is like okay. Ultimate skill damage is useless. So I'm using this amulet just because of 2 rolls, and it's that good. Important mods, like mods that I would value really highly, are +2 ranks to all defensive skills. This gives +2 to all of our shout skills, which is great. It's more resource generation with Rallying Cry. It's more damage. It's more damage reduction. It's a great lineup. Wish I had it. Helpful mods are any damage modifier and movement speed. And then usable mods, honestly, there's a lot of usable mods on amulets, but really just prioritize fury cost reduction and cooldown. And then moving on to rings, I think there's actually no mandatory ring mods, okay? There's a lot of good ring mods, but none of them are required for the build to function. Mods that I think are important are fury generation, max life, vulnerability damage, crit chance, and crit damage. And as you can see, both of my rings have, 3 or 4 of these mods. Helpful mods are max fury, damage to CC'd enemies, damage to near enemies, damage to slowed, bleeding, all of that bucket that adds damage, but it's not as effective as the previous tier. And then usable, there's lots of usable ones, but I would never use a ring unless it had like 3 of the 4 stats that I've already mentioned. You should just be selling it to the vendor. And I think that's all pieces of gear and what stats. Hopefully the pop-ups were helpful in you understanding. Real quick, I'm going to go through, like, let's say I just finished a dungeon. This is my inventory. I'm going through with it and determining what I want to keep. So I'm at the point right now where I have, like, this, you see this white kind of smoke at the top of everything? That means an item is ancestral. So I'm not even looking at items unless they're ancestral. And so I'm just going to go through and tell you instantly what I think of each item so you guys can kind of get an idea of like what's trash and what's good. So I'm instantly looking at the 1,895 damage per second, and I already know this is not usable for me. In order for it to be usable as any term of like main hand weapon, it needs to have like at least 2,200 damage. So this is instantly, I would hover over this, look at the damage, disregard it. Disregard because it doesn't have enough damage. This is not my class, so I don't care about it. Not my class, so I don't care about it. Polearm doesn't have any good stats. Pop off of it. Offhand, it's a sword, which is what I want, so I'd spend some more time looking at this. However, it doesn't have any of the important mods like vulnerability damage, critical damage, core skill damage, so this is instantly not usable for me. Let's look at this mace. Kind of low item power, kind of low damage, not really considering them. Boots, they don't have movement speed or fury cost reduction, so I'm skipping over them. Axe, not 2,200 damage, so I'm not considering it. Not 2,200 damage. Chest, just has a bunch of resistances. This is a terrible chest. Okay, this ring. It has a couple of okay mods, but none of the extremely important ones. This ring. Okay, so this ring would be something that I would consider keeping. It has resource generation, which is fury generation, and it's a max roll. It has damage to close enemies, which is like... I value it as like 0.3. I value it as like a third of a mod. And then vulnerable damage is a very important mod. So the only bad mod is stun enemies. So what I would do is I would throw this on the floor, knowing that I'm not going to actually vendor it or something. Looking at these boots, they have movement speed. I could roll these for fury generation, but it's kind of hard to hit fury generation. They're also low movement speed, so I just instantly look over them. This is the mace, which I'm not using. I only use swords. And then these don't have any like +3 ranks to anything, so not really usable. So I would do that much quicker, but just to kind of get an idea, and I wouldn't even look at any of these yellow items. So let's leave that band there now. I'll come back to it in a sec. And I'm always out of golds because I'm like respecking, I'm like crafting and stuff, so I choose to vendor instead of like a salvage with a hammer. And then I'll go over here, and then I'll look at my unique or my legendaries. So this is like not a mod I'm considering. This is a mod that is good. However, I have plenty of them. I recommend most of you to save this mod, like to extract it. And this is a mod that just min rolls, so I wouldn't even care about it. So I'd come over here to the blacksmith. Get rid of all of those. And then go back to my ring. I'll kind of show you like what I would do with the ring. So pick back up the ring, come over here. And this enchants item. So this is how you can change mods. I'm sure most of you know. But I can click on this mod that I want to replace, damage to stun enemies. And it takes Forgotten Souls, which you can only get during Hell Tides. So make sure you're farming your Hell Tides. Specifically because it's an ancestral ring. And I'll go ahead and throw an enchant on it. We'll see. We're looking for critical strike damage. Okay, critical strike chance. This is a great mod. And this is like a ring that I'd be like, I'm not sure if it's an upgrade or not. I probably wouldn't have rolled it myself because I wouldn't know if it's an upgrade or not. But that's how I'd get like a ring that has, you know, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, resource generation are all extremely good. And then damage to close enemies is meh. And then going over legendary affixes real quick. The ones that I think are most important. I think the Whirlwind crit strike is extremely important, as it gives you 48% crit strike. I'd be saving max rolls of this and not using it on gear unless it was higher tier. This Whirlwind mod is extremely rare, but it has very nice quality of life. It pulls in enemies, which lets you hit more of them, which lets you generate more fury. So not only does it speed up your clear, but it also, like, Seidu produces fury. This mod, I messed up. I should actually have this mod as my weapon, because this is a very big damage multiplier. So I shouldn't have this imprinted, this barrier thing. I should have this mod right here, the Limitless Rage mod, on my two-handed weapon. And all of this will be down below, like in a build guide showing you like the optimal setup. Just going over my gear real quick. So this Disobedience mod, this is a perfect roll. Now, armor is good. It's not amazing. That's kind of the mod that we're choosing, though. It's something that I'm happy with, but it's not irreplaceable. This Unstoppable mod has been overperforming for me. The movement speed is really nice because we gain Unstoppable every time we cast Rallying Cry. And so we get that 19% movement speed for the 4 seconds and then the 6 seconds after, which is really nice. So would highly recommend this mod. And this is the new mod that I've been trying out, and I've been feeling very tanky for it. This 30% damage reduction is huge, and I haven't been dying since I've swapped this. Well, I mean, like, I've maybe died like once. Like, I maybe died like a third as much as I used to with this mod. This, of course, everybody should know about this mod. It's mandatory. The shouts generate fury. This is also mandatory. The shouts reduce cooldown up to 6 seconds. Mandatory. You can't run any other item, any other mod. This, when you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 30% of the base damage as bleeding damage. This is a very powerful mod. It's not powerful enough to go on a slot that gives it a bigger multiplier, like an amulet or a sword. This is extremely noticeable, though. And then this is also a very useful mod, which is essentially just going to be 19% increased, like 19% more damage for me. I hope that clears up everything as far as what gear you should prioritize, what gear you should be rolling for, what uniques you should have. Again, down below, there'll be... I can't actually link it because for some reason YouTube isn't letting me send links because my account's too new. So you'll have to copy and paste the thing that I posted in your browser. And it'll go over all the aspects. It'll have my skill tree. It'll have my paragon tree and everything. It'll also have in the notes tab, it'll have the guide on what to value for each item. Real quick, I'll talk about paragons. I don't want to talk about them too much here. But I would take... The very first thing I would take is this vulnerable node, this exploit. If I was just leveling and got access to my first paragon, I would put it right here. The only reason I have these two switched is because there's more. I can get more multiplier up here rather than down here. But starting, I would put exploit right here in this initial glyph socket. Alright, so if you guys have any more questions, make sure to put them in the comments. I don't want to take too long. Hopefully this gave you guys a good idea. Make sure if you need to refer back, click that link that I sent and check out the notes tab and see all the rankings of the gear. And good luck finding some nice, strong, powerful gear.